Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. A lot of anger doesn't announce itself as anger. It shows up as certainty, as the feeling that you're simply seeing things the way they are, that you're not being harsh, just realistic, but the body doesn't care much about being right. The body just carries the weight, the tight jaw, the shoulders that never quite drop, the quiet readiness even when nothing is happening. That evening, she stood in her small living room with a paper towel tucked under her arm and a spray bottle in her hand. Cleaning the window hadn't been on her plan. Rest had. But the front glass had caught the streetlight at the wrong angle, making every fingerprint and streak stand out, and something in her had latched onto it. The phone lay face down on the coffee table. Earlier, a message had come through. Short, dismissive, familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. Not cruel enough to justify a big reaction, just enough to leave a sting. The kind of message that sits in the background, replaying itself when the room finally gets quiet. She lifted the spray bottle and misted the glass. Tiny droplets scattered across the surface, and when she wiped, the familiar squeak followed. Soft, repetitive, almost soothing. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires whispering against damp pavement. The apartment itself was still lit only by a warm lamp in the corner. She wiped in long strokes, her mind moving the way it always did when she was upset. It ran through examples. People who took without asking, people who never apologized, people who acted like their bad days gave them permission to be careless with others. If anyone asked, she would have said she wasn't angry. She was just done done excusing, done expecting better. The paper towel snagged and tore slightly. She stopped, replaced it, pressed the new sheet flat against the glass. Her reflection shifted in the wet surface, blurred, stretched, broken into pieces by streaks of cleaner. For a moment, she didn't see a face so much as a shape behind a mess. The window wasn't filthy. It wasn't ruined. It was just layered. A week of dust, a few fingerprints, things that hadn't seemed worth noticing until the light hit them just right. She wiped slower. The sound changed. Less squeak, more glide. And with that small change, something in her chest loosened, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to be noticeable. She didn't think about forgiveness. That word felt too heavy, too final, like it demanded something she wasn't ready to give. She wasn't trying to become softer for anyone else. She just wanted the pressure inside her to ease. She noticed how tightly she'd been holding her shoulders, how her breath had been stopping short without her realizing it. As she reached the lower edge of the window, she exhaled longer than before, the kind of breath that happens when the body decides it's safe enough to let go a little. Outside, a couple walked through the pool of streetlight, one carrying a takeout bag, the other pulling a jacket closed. They passed without drama, without meaning, just people moving through their night. She watched them for a second through the cleaner glass. The world didn't suddenly look kinder. It just looked quieter, less personal. She dragged the towel along the bottom edge where grime always collected. The dirt lifted in a dull gray smear, and she felt a strange sense of relief, not because it was gone, but because it had been simple. No argument, no justification. Just noticing something and clearing it. Her phone buzzed once on the table. She didn't reach for it. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she didn't need to answer from this tight place. Standing there, she realized something gently, without turning it into a rule. When hurt stays too close to the surface, it colors everything you see. It doesn't mean your experiences weren't real. It doesn't mean your anger is wrong. It just means the glass you're looking through has been carrying more than it needs to. She finished the window. Not perfectly. There were still faint streaks if you looked closely. But the harshness had softened. The streetlights outside no longer felt like they were pressing in on her. She set the spray bottle down and listened to the apartment. The clock ticking, the fridge humming. Somewhere far away, a siren rose and faded. She wasn't ready to forgive anyone. She didn't need to be. For now, it was enough to know this. She didn't have to keep her face pressed against dirty glass to prove she'd been hurt. She turned off the lamp and walked away from the window, leaving it as it was clear enough. She didn't look at the phone right away, not because she was afraid of what it said, but because she could feel how easily her body would tighten again if she reached for it too fast. So she let it sit there, screen down, while she rinsed her hands at the sink and dried them slowly on a towel that had already seen better days. When she finally picked the phone up, the room hadn't changed. The lamp was still dim. The apartment was still quiet. Nothing dramatic had shifted in the outside world. That helped. It meant she wasn't walking back into the moment the message first landed. She was entering it from somewhere slightly steadier, The message was still what it had been, a few lines, careless in tone, light where it should have been thoughtful. The kind of message that read from the wrong place could reopen a whole history of being overlooked. She felt the familiar spark move through her chest. Not a full flame, more like heat under the skin. Her first impulse was immediate and well-practiced: explain herself, correct the record. Make sure she wasn't misunderstood. Make sure the other person knew they were wrong. Her thumbs hovered over the screen. She noticed how her breath had shortened again. Not all the way, just enough to be a warning. It was the same signal she'd learned to recognize over time, the one that said, if you answer now, you won't actually be answering this message. You'll be answering every other one that came before it, so she didn't type. She read it once more, slower. This time she paid attention not just to the words, but to what happened inside her as she read. The tightening, the urge to defend, the old sense of having to prove her reality was real. She wasn't wrong for feeling that. Anyone in her place would have felt it. But she could see something else too now, that the window behind her was cleaner. The message wasn't the whole story. It was a fragment. A snapshot taken without context, without tone, without the weight of everything she'd been carrying, and the meaning she was about to pour into it. They don't care, they never listen, they always do this. That part was coming from a place that was already tired. She set the phone down again, face up this time. Outside, the street had gone quieter. Fewer cars, longer gaps between sounds. The night was doing what it always did, slowly lowering the volume on everything. She sat back on the couch and let her shoulders drop fully this time. No effort, just gravity. Her hands rested open on her lap, empty. For a moment, she didn't do anything at all. And in that moment, the anger didn't grow. It didn't disappear either. It just stayed the same size, like something being watched instead of fed. She thought about how often anger asks to be proven right, how it wants witnesses, how it wants rehearsal and repetition, how easily attention becomes oxygen. She wasn't interested in putting the fire out by force. She just didn't want to keep fanning it. When she picked up the phone again, she typed a response, but not the one that had been waiting in her chest all evening. The words were shorter, plainer, less precise maybe, but also less sharp. She didn't explain the entire history. She didn't outline every reason she was justified in feeling hurt. She simply named what was true for her in that moment without adding heat. She read it once, then once more. Not to perfect it, but to feel how her body responded to it. The message didn't give her a rush. It didn't feel victorious. That was how she knew it was different. She sent it. The phone didn't light up again right away. There was no instant relief, no resolution, just space. And in that space, she noticed something quiet and important: forgiveness. At least the kind she could live with. Didn't feel like letting someone off the hook. It felt like stepping back from the edge of something that had been costing her more than it was costing them. She wasn't saying what happened was okay. She wasn't pretending it hadn't hurt. She wasn't offering closeness where there wasn't safety. She was simply choosing not to carry the weight of it any longer than necessary. The window behind her reflected less now, that the lamp was off. It had become almost invisible, just a darker square against the night. She liked that. It meant she wasn't focused on it anymore. She stood, turned off the last light, and let the room settle into darkness. The anger hadn't vanished, but it had loosened its grip enough for her to move without its steering. Tomorrow things might feel different. The message might be answered in a way she didn't like, or not answered at all. But that was tomorrow's wait. Tonight she had done enough. She lay down without replaying the conversation again. The streetlight glow barely reached the ceiling. Her breath found its own rhythm. The glass between her and the world didn't need to be perfectly clean. It just needed to be clear enough for her to rest. She stood at the bus stop with her hands in her jacket pockets, shoulders slightly raised against the cold. It wasn't snowing hard. Just a few quiet flakes drifting down slow and unsure, like they hadn't fully decided to land yet. Her shift at the store had ended 10 minutes ago. 8 hours of smiling. 8 hours of folding clothes that weren't hers, fixing displays she didn't care about, answering questions she had already answered 100 times today. Now there was nothing to do but wait. She took her phone out of her pocket. Not because she needed anything, just because her hand moved there on its own. She scrolled without thinking. Someone she knew had posted a photo. A clean apartment, soft lighting, a caption about finally feeling aligned. Another post followed. A promotion, a new relationship, a weekend trip somewhere warm. Her thumb slowed. She didn't feel jealous exactly. It was quieter than that. More like a dull comparison that showed up without asking. They seem ahead. They figured it out. Why do I still feel like this? She locked her phone and stared at the dark glass for a second. Her reflection looked tired. Not dramatic. Just worn down in a way that didn't feel important enough to complain about. The bus was late. A snowflake landed on her sleeve. She didn't brush it away. It sat there for a moment, small, sharp-edged, already melting at the edges. Then another one landed nearby. And another. She lifted her arms slightly, watching them collect. They didn't look the same. One was thicker. One looked almost like a tiny star. Another was barely there at all, more suggestion than shape. She had learned somewhere, maybe in school, maybe online, that no two snowflakes are identical. That even under the same sky, falling through the same cold air, each one forms differently. At the time, it had sounded like a cute fact, something for trivia nights. Standing there now, it felt different. She thought about how often she measured herself using other people as the ruler. Their pace, their timing, their highlight moments. She realized how strange that was. Comparing two people assumed they were meant to be the same thing, formed the same way, meant to land in the same place at the same time. But even snow didn't work like that. Another flake landed on her glove. She watched it dissolve into a tiny dark spot, gone almost as soon as it appeared. It hadn't failed. It had just finished being what it was. She let her arm drop back to her side. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, a notification she didn't check. For once, she didn't feel pulled toward it. Her chest felt tight but not heavy, more like something loosening just a little. She thought about her own days. They didn't look impressive online, no big announcements, no clean captions. But she showed up. She paid her bills. She helped customers find what they needed. She went home tired and still tried again the next morning. There were things she had survived that no one scrolling past her life would ever see. The bus lights appeared down the road faint at first. As it got closer, the snowflakes became harder to see. The glow swallowed them up. But she knew they were still there, still falling, still different. She stepped forward slightly, readying herself to board. For the first time that evening, she felt a small shift inside. Not joy, not relief, just space. Space where comparison usually sat. And in that space, there was no need to be anyone else. She sat by the window on the bus, forehead resting lightly against the cool glass. The city slid by in soft streaks of light and shadow. People around her were quiet. Someone tapped a foot. Someone else scrolled on a phone screen, glowing pale blue in the dark. She didn't feel the urge to look anymore. The bus moved through the snow without drama. No sudden turns, no rush. She watched the flakes hit the window and disappear on contact. Each one lasted only a moment, long enough to arrive, not long enough to be remembered. She wondered when she had started believing that worth had to be visible to count. At some point, she had picked up the idea that if something wasn't noticed, praised, or shared, it didn't really matter. That if no one reacted, then maybe it wasn't real. But the snow didn't seem to agree. It kept falling whether anyone admired it or not. She thought about her own life again, the parts that never made it into conversations. The nights she came home and cooked something simple just to feel taken care of. The mornings she got up even when she didn't feel ready. None of it was loud. None of it asked for approval. And yet, it was still her life. The bus stopped at a red light. Everything paused for a few seconds. In the quiet, she noticed her breathing. Slow, steady. She hadn't done anything to earn that moment of calm. It wasn't a reward. It was just there when she stopped fighting for something else. She realized something gently without force. Maybe she didn't need to add more to herself. Not more achievements. Not a better version. Not a cleaner story. Maybe she only needed to remove the things that weren't hers to carry. Other people's timelines. Other people's definitions of enough. Other people's highlights. The light turned green. The bus moved again. She imagined herself like one of those snowflakes, formed by conditions she didn't choose, shaped by moments she couldn't control, still complete in her own way, not better, not worse, just different. When the bus reached her stop, she stood and pulled the cord. The bell rang soft, ordinary. She stepped down onto the sidewalk. The snow had almost stopped now. Only a few flakes drifted lazily through the streetlight. She took a deep breath before heading home. Nothing about her life had changed in a dramatic way. No problem had been solved. But she felt less crowded inside. And for tonight, that was enough. Some fears don't show up like panic. They show up as a quiet conclusion you start believing. It's over. It's too late. Nothing's growing anymore. It was late evening, the kind of winter night where the air feels thin and clean and the whole neighborhood looks slightly paused. A person stood on a small back porch behind a rental house wearing an old hoodie and socks that didn't quite match. The porch light was off, but a little glow came from inside through the kitchen window, soft and steady. Out back there was a row of planters lined up along the railing. They'd been there since late summer basil that had gone wild, cherry tomatoes that tried their best, a small pot of mint that refused to die. Now everything looked brown and flattened, like someone had pressed the life out of it with a palm. The soil on top was dark and firm from cold. They held a mug with both hands, letting the warmth seep into their fingers. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's HVAC unit kicked on with a low, familiar hum. It wasn't a pretty sound, but it was steady. It made the night feel less empty. They didn't come outside to garden. Not really. There was nothing to garden. They came outside because the house felt too close around their thoughts, and the porch felt like a small, neutral zone. No screens, no notifications, no lists staring at them. They set the mug down on a little plastic table that wobbled if you bumped it. The cold air touched their cheeks and made them blink slowly. For a moment they just stood there, hands resting on the railing, looking at the planters the way you might look at an old photo you don't know what to do with. It wasn't really about the plants. This had been a strange stretch of life. Not dramatic, not tragic, just uncertain in that steady way uncertainty can be. A job that didn't feel secure anymore. A relationship that had turned quiet, then ended without a big fight. Plans that once felt obvious now felt like they belonged to someone else. When people asked, they said, "I'm fine." And they meant it in the way a person means I'm functioning. Bills were paid, groceries were bought, emails were answered. But inside there was a low fear that kept repeating itself almost like background noise. What if this is it? What if the part of me that grows is gone? They stepped closer to the planters. Their fingers hovered over the soil, then pressed lightly into it. The top layer was cold, firm. It didn't give much. They pulled their hand back and rubbed their fingertips together, feeling the grit. In their mind, the planters had become proof. Proof that something had ended. Proof that seasons don't always come back. Proof that maybe life just stops quietly without a clean reason. It was an old kind of fear disguised as realism. They crouched down, knees creaking a little, and looked closer. Not at the dead stems, those were easy to see, but at the soil line. There were tiny pieces of old leaves curled like paper. There were small tracks in the dirt where something had moved earlier. Something small. A bug. A worm. Maybe nothing important. Still, it was movement. They found a thin twig and started to stir the soil a little, not digging deep, just loosening the surface. The sound was soft, dry grains shifting, a faint crepe against plastic. The HVAC hum continued, and somewhere far off, a car door shut. A quick, ordinary thunk in the distance. They weren't trying to bring anything back. They were just touching what was there. And that's when they remembered something they'd learned years ago without meaning to. In winter, the most important part of a plant isn't what you see. The visible part can look gone. The life doesn't always stay above ground. It moves down. It holds itself tighter. It waits. They sat back on their heels and let that thought land without squeezing it. Maybe that's what this feels like, they thought. Not dying, just going underground. A few minutes passed. Their breath made a small cloud in front of their face, then vanished. They looked at the planters again, and the fear tried to come back in the same voice as before. Still looks dead. Still looks like nothing. But something had shifted in how they were seeing it. The fear was still there, but it didn't feel like the only truth in the room anymore. It was just one interpretation, and interpretations can be loud even when they're wrong. They stood up and brushed dirt from their knees. Their hands were cold now, and they wrapped their fingers around the mug again. The warmth felt almost exaggerated against the winter air. Inside the kitchen, the clock on the microwave showed a time that looked too late to be meaningful, but not late enough to call it morning. The house behind them was quiet. No TV, no music, just the faint sound of the refrigerator cycling on and off, doing its small job without being asked. They leaned their shoulder against the doorframe and stayed there. The mind loves a clean storyline. If the leaves are gone, the plant is gone. If you feel stuck, you're finished. If you can't see the next step, there must not be one. But real life isn't always that clean. Sometimes the next step is hidden for a while. Sometimes growth is so quiet it doesn't show up as progress. Sometimes you don't look better, you just look still. And still can be a kind of strength. They took one slow sip of the drink. It tasted like something they didn't even care about, tea maybe, or leftover coffee reheated. The taste wasn't the point. The warmth was. They looked down again at the planters. The dead stems didn't bother them as much now. They were just what happens when weather changes, when light gets scarce, when the world tells living things to conserve. And then, as if their hands needed something to do that wasn't scrolling or fixing, they reached into one of the pots and gently pulled out a dead stalk. It came free with almost no resistance. They set it aside, then another. Small, slow motions. Nothing intense. No big cleanup. Just making a little space. The fear didn't vanish. It rarely does not right away. But it softened around the edges when they stopped arguing with it. When they stopped demanding proof that everything would be okay. Maybe the proof wouldn't come tonight. Maybe tonight was just a quiet reminder what looks like an ending on the surface can be a different kind of season underneath. They stood there a while longer, holding the mug, listening to the steady hum in the distance and feeling the cold air keep them awake in a simple, clean way. Not anxious awake, just present. Then they went back inside, leaving the planters outside in the dark, doing whatever winter things do when no one is watching. And somewhere beneath that dark surface, something small remained, not performing. Not proving, just alive in its own quiet way. Later that night, after the mug was rinsed and left upside down in the sink, the quiet returned in a different way. Not the empty kind. more like a settled quiet, the kind that comes when nothing is asking for attention. They didn't go straight to bed. Instead, they moved slowly through the house, turning off lights one by one, noticing how each room changed when the light went out. The living room became softer, the hallway longer. Shadows rearranged themselves without meaning anything in particular. In the bedroom, the window was cracked open just a little. Cold air slipped in clean and sharp. They pulled the blanket higher, not because they were cold, but because the weight felt grounding, familiar. Something the body understands, even when the mind keeps asking questions. The fear tried again, as it often does when things get quiet. It came back as a thought that sounded practical. You should be doing more. You should have figured this out by now. Other people don't seem this stuck. They didn't push the thought away. They also didn't follow it. It hovered there like breath on glass, visible, but temporary. Their eyes rested on the ceiling, tracing nothing in particular. A small crack ran diagonally near the corner, something they'd noticed 100 times before but never fixed. It didn't bother them. It had become part of the room's language. They thought again of the planters outside, of how sure they had felt earlier that everything was over, how convincing that certainty had been, and how quickly it had softened once they looked a little closer. Fear often feels solid because it talks in full sentences. It sounds confident. It says things like always and never. It likes to pretend it has done the research. But fear usually only sees what's above ground. They shifted onto their side, one hand resting against the mattress, fingers lightly curled. Their breath found a slower rhythm without instruction. In, out. Not deep. Just easy. What if this pause isn't a failure? What if this quiet doesn't mean nothing is happening? Those questions didn't demand answers. They didn't open into plans. They just made a little room in the mind, the way loosening soil makes room for water. Outside, the neighborhood stayed still. No sirens, no voices. Just the occasional whisper of tires far away, the sound stretching thin as it moved through cold air. They imagined the roots beneath the planters, not as something poetic, but as something practical. Fibers doing exactly what they were meant to do, holding, storing, waiting without anxiety. Roots don't panic about timing. They don't rush spring. They don't compare themselves to last year's leaves. They respond to conditions. They adjust quietly. There was a relief in that thought, not as an idea to copy, but as a reminder that life doesn't require constant visibility to be real. The fear softened again, not because it was defeated, but because it wasn't being fed. No arguing, no reassurance loop, just space. Their bodies sank a little deeper into the mattress. The weight of the blanket pressed gently against their chest, steady and neutral. The cold air from the window brushed their face, then moved on. They remembered other times in life that had felt like endings. Moments that had seemed final, heavy, undeniable. And how looking back, those moments now looked more like turns than stops. Not because everything had worked out perfectly, but because something had continued often in a direction they couldn't have predicted at the time. Not all growth announces itself. Some of it happens while you're tired. Some of it happens while you doubt. Some of it happens while you're convinced nothing is changing. Their eyelids grew heavier, not suddenly, but gradually, like a dimmer switch being turned down without urgency. The mind drifted not into stories, but into simple images: dark soil, slow water, the feel of warmth returning to cold fingers. Fear didn't disappear completely. It rarely does. But it no longer filled the whole room. It was just one presence among others, alongside breath, weight, quiet, and time moving forward without asking permission. They let themselves rest in that balance. Outside, winter continued doing winter things. Inside, the house held steady. And beneath the surface of things that looked still, life kept moving in its own direction at its own pace. Nothing needed to be solved tonight. Nothing needed to prove itself. Some seasons are for showing. Others are for holding. And this one quietly was doing exactly what it was meant to do. Some worries don't arrive loudly. They don't announce themselves. They just stay. They sit quietly in the back of the mind while you're doing normal things: washing a cup, answering a message, driving a familiar road. And before you notice, the mind is already replaying, predicting, adjusting. Not because something is truly wrong, but because the habit of thinking has learned to stay awake. That evening, the person walked along a quiet stretch of beach. Not the kind with crowds or music. Just wet sand, a pale sky, and the steady sound of water pulling back into itself. It had been a long day, the kind where nothing dramatic happened, yet everything felt heavy anyway. Too many small decisions, too many thoughts that didn't fully finish. Shoes were left in the car, bare feet pressed into the cool sand. Each step left a clear mark behind heel-arched toes perfectly shaped for a moment. The person noticed this without trying to. The mind tends to notice patterns when it's tired. Behind them, a long line of footprints stretched back toward the parking area. Ahead, the beach curved, gently disappearing into a soft gray distance. No rush to get anywhere. No reason to turn back yet. The thoughts came along, of course. They always did. Did I say the wrong thing earlier? What if tomorrow goes badly? Why do I keep thinking about this one small moment? Each question landed like another footprint, clear, defined, convincing. The mind treated each one as if it needed to be preserved, examined, solved. As if thinking harder would finally bring relief. The person stopped walking for a moment and looked down. The footprints behind were still there, but closer to the waterline, the edges were already softening. Not gone, just less sharp. The next wave rolled in quietly, reached a little farther than the last, and blurred one of the older prints almost completely. Nothing dramatic happened. No lesson arrived fully formed. Just that small, ordinary sight. When the mind is anxious, it often believes that thoughts must be held tightly, or they'll cause damage if left unattended, like something important will be lost if it isn't replayed enough times. But standing there watching the water do what water always does, something subtle shifted. The waves weren't trying to erase anything. They weren't correcting the sand. They weren't rushing. They were just moving as they had all day, as they would long after night came. The person began walking again, slower this time. The body found its own pace without instruction. Another set of footprints appeared side by side with the earlier ones. For a while, both sets existed together, the older ones fading, the new ones fresh, past and present overlapping without conflict. The mind still offered thoughts. That didn't stop. But they felt slightly less urgent now, less sharp at the edges. There's something exhausting about trying to keep every footprint intact, trying to remember every step perfectly, trying to make sure nothing ever washes away. It asks the mind to do a job it was never meant to do. A wave came in closer, touching the person's toes. Cold, brief, then gone. The body reacted before the mind did a small shift of weight, a quiet inhale. No analysis required. For a moment, attention dropped out of thinking and into sensation. The temperature of the water, the firmness of the sand, the steady sound that didn't need interpretation. Behind them, more footprints were disappearing. Not because they were unimportant, but because the beach had no need to keep records. The sand didn't argue with the water. It didn't insist on permanence. The person noticed how often their own mind did the opposite, how it tried to hold every moment in place, replaying conversations, rehearsing outcomes, polishing worries until they felt solid and real. As if anxiety itself were proof of responsibility. But standing there, nothing was being asked. No fixing, no deciding, no improvement. Just walking, just leaving marks, just letting the ocean respond in its own time. The person didn't make a promise to stop overthinking. That would have been another thing to manage. Instead, there was a quieter recognition. Thoughts don't need to be erased to lose their power. Sometimes they soften simply by not being protected. Another wave came. Another set of footprints blurred. The beach kept breathing in this slow, patient way, unconcerned with what stayed or left. The person kept walking, not toward an answer, but along the shoreline where nothing asked to be held forever. And for now, that was enough. The shoreline curved gently ahead, and the person followed it without thinking much about where it led. The light had shifted. What was once pale had deepened into something softer, closer to evening. The air cooled just enough to be noticeable, like the day quietly letting go of its grip. A few steps in, the person glanced back again. Not out of concern, more out of curiosity. Most of the older footprints were gone now. Not erased in a clean line, but smudged, interrupted, half-remembered. A heel here, a toe there. The rest blended back into the wide, even surface of the sand. It was strange how quickly the mind wanted to comment. That one disappeared fast. That one lasted longer. That one is still visible. Even now, the habit of measuring remained. The habit of comparing what stayed and what didn't. But the beach didn't seem to care. The waves kept their rhythm. Sometimes they reached farther. Sometimes they pulled back. There was no pattern meant to be understood, no message hidden in the timing. The person slowed again, noticing the sound more clearly now. The water didn't crash. It folded in on itself, then retreated, leaving behind a thin, shimmering layer that reflected the sky for a brief second before sinking in. Overthinking often feels like this, layers of reflection that never quite settle. One thought triggers another. One memory pulls up a dozen more. Each seems important in isolation, but together, they blur the ground you're standing on. The person bent slightly and pressed a hand into the sand. It held the shape of the palm for a moment, then softened as moisture crept in from the sides. No resistance, no effort, just a quiet change. The mind noticed, then grew quiet again. There's a particular kind of anxiety that comes from believing every thought is a signal, that if you don't respond immediately, something will go wrong. It trains the body to stay alert long after danger has passed, long after there's anything useful to do. But here, standing at the edge of the water, nothing needed a response. The person straightened and continued walking. The beach was nearly empty now. A few distant silhouettes moved slowly, each in their own quiet world. No one was watching the footprints. No one was counting them. That too felt like a relief. At some point, the person noticed that the inner commentary had thinned out, not vanished, just spaced farther apart. Thoughts arrived, then left like birds crossing a wide sky. They didn't land. They didn't stay long enough to build nests. One thought did linger for a moment. What if worries are like footprints? They appear because walking happens, because living happens, not because something has gone wrong. You don't stop walking just to avoid leaving marks. And you don't need to follow every mark once it's made. Another wave reached up, brushing the edge of a fresh footprint before it had time to harden. The print didn't disappear entirely. It simply lost its sharp outline. It became less specific, less demanding. The person felt a familiar urge to hold on to this moment, to remember it clearly, to make sure it stayed meaningful. And then almost immediately, there was a recognition of that urge itself. Even this doesn't need to be held. The beach would look different tomorrow. The tide would be different. The light would shift again. None of that depended on the person understanding it fully. There was something steady in that. The person turned back toward the parking area as the air cooled further. Each step still left a mark. That didn't change. But the need to check behind each time had faded. Trust replaced it, not a loud confidence, just a quiet allowance. Allowing thoughts to come, allowing them to go, allowing the mind to rest between waves. Near the end of the walk, the sand grew firmer. Fewer footprints showed up here. The ground held less, and the water reached this area more often. It felt like a natural boundary, one the body understood without explanation. The person paused one last time, looking out at the open water. The horizon was smooth, uninterrupted. Nothing there needed to be solved or named. The worries from earlier hadn't been defeated. They hadn't been fixed. They simply no longer asked for constant attention. Like footprints left behind on a wide beach, they were allowed to fade on their own schedule. And with that, the person headed back carrying nothing extra, leaving nothing that needed to last. Anger can feel like energy, like clarity, like you finally have the courage to say what you should have said. And sometimes it really is that. But there's another kind of anger that doesn't bring anything clean with it. It just brings heat. It doesn't solve the problem. It keeps the problem alive because it keeps feeding it. He was sitting in his car in the driveway, engine off, seatbelt already unclicked, hands still on the steering wheel, like he hadn't fully arrived home yet. The house was dark, except for a faint glow through the blinds. The neighborhood was quiet in that late-hour way. No lawn sprinklers, no kids, no garage doors, just the occasional far-off sound of tires passing over a main road. The phone was in the cup holder. The screen was lit. A thread of messages sat open, and his thumb hovered over the keyboard. He had typed something sharp, deleted it, typed something longer, explaining everything, deleted that too, then typed something short again, too short, the kind of short that's really a slap. He wasn't proud of any of it, but he also didn't feel calm. Calm wasn't available. What he felt was that tight, bright pressure behind the eyes, like a light turned up too high in his head. It had started as something small earlier in the day. A comment, a tone, a little joke that wasn't funny. The kind of moment you can brush off in public, then later, when you're alone, it replays with different lighting. In the replay, you notice the disrespect more clearly. You notice the pattern. You notice how long you've been swallowing things. By the time he got in the car after work, the anger had already grown. Not because the original moment got worse, but because he kept returning to it. Each return brought a fresh surge, like throwing another log onto the same fire. Now in the driveway, he could feel his body wanting motion. His knee bounced once. His shoulders were forward. His jaw was tight. He stared at the words he'd typed. They felt satisfying in a dark way, like hitting a wall with your fist. Painful, but honest. Immediate. He was about to send it. Then, the strangest thing happened. Not an insight, not a spiritual moment, just a tiny, ordinary detail that interrupted the whole machine in his head. The porch light clicked on across the street. A neighbor stepped outside for a second, barefoot, holding a small bag of trash. The light turned their face into a pale blur for a moment, then they disappeared back inside. The porch light stayed on. That was it. Nothing important. But the pause it created in him was real. Like the mind had tripped over something neutral and for a second stopped sprinting. He looked at his phone again and saw something he hadn't wanted to see. This message wasn't going to fix anything. It wasn't even going to express what he really felt. It was only going to spread the fire into tomorrow. Because anger, when it's hot, doesn't just want to speak. It wants to land. It wants to hurt back. It wants the other person to feel what you felt. And the problem is, once you send that kind of message, you can't take it back. Even if you apologize later, even if you explain later, the heat stays in the room. His thumb hovered again. He felt his chest tighten, like his body was arguing. Send it. They need to know. They deserve it. And maybe part of that was true. Maybe the other person had been careless. Maybe they had been unfair. Maybe they had been repeating the same pattern for years. But there was another truth, too quieter and less dramatic. He didn't want to spend his night like this. He didn't want to give his attention to the same flame over and over, just to keep it alive. He had once watched a video about wildfires, how wind feeds them, how dry brush becomes fuel, how one gust can turn a contained fire into something that eats miles. He remembered one line from a firefighter interview, something simple. You don't fight a wildfire by giving it more oxygen. He wasn't dealing with a forest. He was dealing with a message thread. But his body felt the same heat, the same spreading. He set the phone down in the cup holder and forced himself to do one thing that wasn't about the conversation. He looked around the car like he'd never been in it before. The dashboard dust, the little stack of receipts in the console, the faint smell of coffee that had spilled weeks ago and never fully left, the silence that existed, whether he was angry or not. For a full 10 seconds, he did nothing. In that small pause, the anger didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It stopped being a command. It became a feeling. Still unpleasant, still real, but no longer in charge. He picked the phone up again. The message was still there waiting. He didn't delete it yet. He just stared at it and asked himself one plain question. If I send this, does my life get calmer or does it get louder? The answer came fast. He didn't want louder, so he didn't send it. Not because the other person was right, not because he was above it, but because tonight he could feel the cost. He could feel how attention was feeding the fire and how he was the one holding the match. He placed the phone face down again, like closing a lid. Then he finally took his hands off the steering wheel and let them rest in his lap. The porch light across the street was still on, a small, steady glow. It didn't ask anything from him. It didn't demand a response. It just existed quiet and constant while the rest of the neighborhood slept. He sat there a moment longer, letting that steadiness be contagious. He stayed in the car longer than he needed to. Not because he was frozen, but because he could feel how close he still was to doing something he'd regret. The anger hadn't left. It had just stopped shouting. Now it sat in his chest like a hot coal, quiet, but very much alive. He knew this feeling. The part where you don't explode, but you don't feel better either. The part where restraint starts to feel like pressure. Like holding a door shut while something keeps pushing from the other side. He opened the car door and stepped out into the night. The air was cooler than inside the car, and that helped. He locked the door, the soft click sounding louder than it should have in the quiet. The house stood there, familiar and dark, waiting. Inside, he didn't turn on the overhead lights, just the small lamp by the couch. The room felt still, like it was holding its breath. He set his keys down and noticed his hands were slightly shaky. Not dramatically, just enough to be honest. He sat on the edge of the couch and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The phone was still in his pocket, heavy. He could feel it even without touching it. The old habit would have been to distract himself. Turn on the TV, scroll, drown the feeling in noise until it dulled. But tonight, something in him wanted to do less, not more. He wanted the fire to burn down on its own without fresh fuel. Anger has a strange relationship with time. When you keep feeding it, it feels urgent, immediate. like something has to be done right now. But when you stop feeding it, it reveals something else underneath. Often it's hurt, or disappointment, or the tired feeling of having the same boundary crossed again. He closed his eyes for a moment and let his breath drop lower. Not in a practiced way, just enough to notice that it could. Images floated up without being invited. Other moments with the same person, different days, different words, all small, none catastrophic. But together, they formed a pattern. And patterns are what turn irritation into anger. He saw something else too, and it wasn't flattering. He saw how much of his energy he'd been giving away by replaying the same story. How the other person had moved on hours ago while he was still sitting in the heat of it. That realization didn't make him kinder. It made him tired. He stood up and walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, drank it slowly. The cold helped. It anchored him in something physical, something real. The anger didn't disappear, but it lost some of its edge, like a blade set down instead of being swung. He thought again about the wildfire image. How fires don't only consume what they touch, they change the air. They make it hard to breathe even for people far away from the flames. He didn't want to live in that air. He picked up his phone and looked at the message again. It still bothered him. That hadn't changed. But now he could see it without the red haze around the edges. He could read it as one moment, not a verdict on his worth or a summary of the relationship. He deleted the unsent message, not as a gesture of forgiveness, just as a practical decision. Those words belonged to a version of him that was overheated. He didn't need to give them a future. He opened a new note instead and typed a few sentences that he didn't plan to send to anyone. They weren't polite, they weren't measured. They were honest in the rawest way. He wrote exactly what had hurt, exactly what he wished had been different. He didn't soften it. He didn't justify it either. He let it exist. When he was done, he put the phone down and didn't reread it. The words had done their job just by leaving his body. He noticed then how much space there was in the room, how the quiet wasn't empty but full of ordinary sounds, the fridge cycling on, the faint tick of a clock somewhere, his own breathing slower now. Forgiveness, he realized, didn't arrive as a feeling, at least not tonight. It arrived as a choice not to keep setting himself on fire to keep someone else warm. It arrived as the decision to stop feeding something that only grew when he paid it attention. Tomorrow he might say something, or he might not. He could address the issue later from a steadier place, or he could decide it wasn't worth reopening. Both options existed now, and having options felt better than being trapped in reaction. He turned off the lamp and stood in the dark for a moment. The anger was still there, faint but present. He didn't push it away. He just didn't invite it to take over the night. As he lay down, the image of the porch light across the street came back to him. Steady, unbothered, not fighting the dark, just illuminating its own small circle. That felt like enough. He let the night take the rest. The guitar had been leaning against the wall for months. Not broken, not dusty enough to look abandoned, just untouched. He noticed it one evening while turning off the lights. The room was quiet in that end-of-day way. No music, no TV, just the soft hum of the refrigerator in the other room. He reached for the lamp, then stopped. The guitar was still there, exactly where he had left it. He used to play more often, not on stages, not for anyone special, just for himself late at night when the world felt too loud. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped. There hadn't been a clear reason. Life had simply filled the space. Work, responsibilities. The tired kind of evenings where even small joys feel like extra effort. He told himself he would get back to it when things slowed down, when he felt more like himself again. He walked over and picked it up. The wood was cool under his fingers, familiar, unchanged. He sat on the edge of the couch and rested the guitar on his knee. Didn't tune it, didn't play. He just held it. A thought surfaced uninvited. What's the point? I don't even play anymore. It wasn't cruel, just practical. The kind of thought that sounds reasonable enough to believe. He looked at the strings. They were still intact, slightly dull maybe, but not ruined. He ran his thumb gently across them. A soft, uneven sound filled the room. It wasn't a song, barely a note. Still, the sound lingered for a second before fading. He noticed something then. The guitar hadn't lost its value in the silence. It hadn't become less of a guitar just because no one was listening. It was still what it was. He leaned back and thought about himself. How often he measured his worth by what he produced, by how useful he felt, by how visible his efforts were. When those things slowed down, the doubt moved in quickly. He set the guitar back against the wall gently this time. Not like an object being put away, more like something being trusted to wait. He turned off the lamp. In the dark, the room felt different. Not emptier, just quieter. And for the first time in a while, the silence didn't feel like failure. He woke up the next morning before his alarm. The room was still dim, the kind of light that didn't ask anything from you yet. For a moment he lay there listening. The building settling, a car passing far below, someone's footsteps in the hallway. Nothing special, and yet he felt strangely present. As he got up, his eyes moved instinctively toward the corner of the room. The guitar was still there, leaning exactly where he had placed it the night before. It didn't call to him. It didn't demand anything. It just existed. While making coffee, his mind drifted back to a familiar pattern. How quickly he judged himself during quiet periods. How easily he confused stillness with falling behind. If he wasn't creating, improving, or contributing in a visible way, he assumed something was wrong. He carried his mug back into the living room and sat down. The guitar remained silent, and that was okay. He thought about all the objects in the room that held value without constant use. The couch that didn't prove itself every day. The books that waited patiently on the shelf. The lamp that stood ready even when it wasn't turned on. None of them had to earn their place each morning. Why had he decided that he did? He realized that somewhere along the way, he had tied his worth to sound, to output, to being noticed. Silence to him had started to feel like disappearance. But the guitar showed him something else. Silence wasn't absence. It was rest. It was potential not being spent. He reached over and touched the neck of the guitar again. Not to play, just to acknowledge it. There was no pressure to return to who he used to be. No need to reclaim a past version of himself just to feel valid. The instrument didn't care how long it had been quiet. It didn't keep score. It was ready when it was ready. And so was he. He stood up, rinsed his mug, and set it in the sink. The day would begin soon. Emails, meetings, responsibilities. But something had shifted. He didn't feel the urge to prove anything before stepping into it. As he left the apartment, the guitar stayed where it was, silent, whole. And for the first time, he understood that his value worked the same way. Fear doesn't always come as a sharp feeling. Sometimes it comes as distance. The space between where you are and where you think you're supposed to be. The stretch of road where you can't see what's ahead and your mind fills the gap for you. It was late, but not late enough to feel dramatic. Just one of those in-between hours when the day has let go and the night hasn't fully taken over. A person was driving home on a familiar stretch of freeway. The kind they could almost do with their eyes closed, but didn't, of course. Traffic was light. Not empty, just thinned out. Enough space between cars to breathe. The dashboard glowed softly. Nothing flashy. Speed steady. The radio was off, not because they wanted silence for some higher reason, but because music felt like too much information right now. Silence felt easier to manage. Ahead, the road curved gently to the right. One of those long bends where you lose sight of what comes next. No dramatic turn, no warning signs, just a slow disappearance of the lane as it slides out of view. They felt it in their chest before they named it. That small tightening. That familiar thought. What if something's wrong up there? It wasn't about the road. Lately, life had started to feel like this stretch of freeway. Decisions half made, conversations postponed. Plans that used to feel solid now felt provisional, penciled in. They weren't in crisis. That almost made it worse. There was nothing obvious to fix, just a constant sense of not knowing. The mind doesn't like not knowing. It wants edges. It wants conclusions. It wants to see the whole map before it agrees to move forward. And when it can't, it calls the feeling fear, even if nothing is actually threatening you. Their hands rested at the bottom of the steering wheel. Not tight, not loose. The car moved smoothly following the curve without needing instruction. Headlights swept over the asphalt, lighting only what was immediately in front of them. Nothing more. They noticed how the road didn't ask them to see the entire way. It only asked for the next few seconds, the next small stretch of pavement, the next marker line sliding past. Still, the thought came back. What if the road ends? It was an irrational thought. They knew this freeway. It didn't end like that. But fear doesn't need novelty. it uses familiar places too. They remembered being younger, always wanting to know the outcome before committing. If I can see how this turns out, I'll start. If I can be sure, I'll go. But certainty has a way of staying just out of reach. The bend continued. The far edge of the road stayed hidden. No accident lights, no sudden stops. Just darkness ahead, patiently waiting its turn to be lit. They exhaled without realizing they'd been holding their breath. There's something strange about curves. They feel like interruptions, but they're actually part of the flow. The river doesn't stop because it turns. It doesn't apologize for blocking your view. It keeps moving whether you trust it or not. A car passed them on the left, briefly lighting the inside of their vehicle. A face flashed by. Someone else heading somewhere unknown to them, but apparently not a problem. They thought about all the times fear had shown up, not as danger, but as hesitation. The job they delayed applying for because they couldn't picture the outcome. The relationship they held back from because they didn't know where it would go. The version of themselves they postponed becoming because it didn't come with guarantees. Fear loves the phrase, "not yet." It sounds reasonable, responsible, but sometimes it's just a way of staying still. The road began to straighten, gradually, almost imperceptibly. The bend loosened, and a longer stretch of freeway revealed itself, lit by a sequence of streetlights like quiet reassurance. Nothing special, just continuation. They didn't feel relieved exactly, more like corrected, as if something inside them had been assuming the worst without checking the facts. They realized they'd been gripping the wheel more than necessary. Their fingers softened. The car didn't wobble. It didn't need their tension to stay on course. That was something worth noticing. Life too often keeps moving even when you stop clenching around it. The fear didn't vanish. It rarely does. It just lost its argument, lost its claim to being the only explanation. They passed a familiar exit and didn't take it. Not because they were avoiding something, but because tonight they felt okay staying on the road a little longer, letting the drive finish itself. The sky above the freeway was dark but clear. No stars visible this close to the city, just a wide open black that didn't feel threatening. It felt neutral, spacious. They thought about the river again. How standing at a bend doesn't mean the water ends there. It just means you don't get to see everything at once. Maybe that's not a flaw in the design. Maybe that's the design. The car moved forward. The road held. The night stayed quiet. And for now, that was enough to keep going. The drive continued without asking anything from them. No sudden lane changes, no alerts. Just the steady agreement between the car and the road that if both kept doing what they were doing, they'd arrive somewhere eventually. They reached another curve gentler than the last. This one wrapped left, then eased open again. The pattern repeated itself, and something about that repetition felt oddly calming. Turn, reveal, continue. Nothing dramatic, nothing final. They noticed their shoulders drop just a little, not because they told them to, but because there was no longer a reason to hold them up. The body is often ahead of the mind when it comes to letting go. Fear had a quieter voice now. It wasn't shouting questions anymore. It was more like a background suggestion. You should be careful. You should think ahead. Those thoughts didn't feel wrong. They just didn't need to be in charge. The headlights kept doing their job, illuminating exactly what was necessary and no more. The road didn't demand vision beyond that. It didn't punish them for not knowing what was miles ahead. It accepted their limited view and worked with it. They thought about how often they'd tried to light up the entire future at once. How exhausting that had been, replaying conversations that hadn't happened yet, planning responses to outcomes that never arrived, carrying anxiety like a responsibility. Maybe seeing everything isn't the point. Maybe the point is staying with what's here long enough to notice it's enough to move forward. A semi-truck rolled by in the opposite direction, its lights briefly flooding the inside of the car. For a second, everything was bright and loud. Then it passed, and the night returned to its usual tone, unchanged. That moment stayed with them. How quickly intensity comes and goes. How rarely it lasts as long as fear predicts. They reached a stretch of road where the city thinned out. Fewer buildings, fewer exits. The darkness felt wider here, but not heavier. It was the kind of darkness that doesn't hide things so much as give them space. The river image came back again uninvited. Standing at the edge, watching water move past a bend you can't see around. Trusting that movement doesn't need your supervision. Rivers don't pause at uncertainty. They don't wait until the whole route is visible. They move with gravity, with conditions, with what's present. There was a lesson there, but it didn't need to be spelled out. It worked better as an image, something the mind could rest on without picking apart. They changed lanes smoothly, signal clicking on and off, a small sound that felt reassuring in its predictability. One thing at a time. Indicate, move, continue. The fear tried one last angle. What if you choose wrong? They let the question pass without answering it. Not every question needs a response. Some lose their power when they're not fed. The freeway sign for their exit appeared ahead. White letters glowing softly. Familiar. They didn't feel rushed to take it, but they did. The car slowed. The turn was easy. As they moved onto the ramp, the road narrowed, then curved again. Another bend, another moment of not seeing what was next. And yet, nothing about it felt threatening anymore. They realized something then, not as a breakthrough, but as a quiet recognition. Uncertainty hadn't gone anywhere. They just weren't fighting it. And in not fighting it, it had become lighter. The car rolled through a neighborhood of dim streetlights and quiet houses. Windows dark, lawns still. The world felt like it was holding its breath, but in a peaceful way. They parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment before getting out. The silence after the car shut down was deep, complete. No hum, no movement, just presence. They didn't try to name what they felt. Naming would have pulled them back into analysis. Instead, they stayed with the simple fact that they had arrived without needing to see every mile beforehand. That felt important. They stepped out of the car. Cool air wrapped around them. Somewhere nearby, a porch light flicked on, then off. A small, ordinary moment in someone else's evening. As they walked toward the door, they thought again of the road behind them. All those curves, all that darkness that had turned out to be just night. Fear often tells us the bend is the end. Experience slowly teaches otherwise. They unlocked the door, went inside, and let the day finish itself. Some things don't reveal themselves all at once. They reveal themselves as you keep moving. And for tonight, that was enough. Some tension doesn't feel dramatic. It feels practical, responsible, necessary. It shows up as a tight jaw while reading emails, a stiff back while standing in line, a quiet belief that if you stay firm enough, focused enough, nothing will fall apart. That afternoon, the person stood in a small backyard behind a modest house. Nothing special about it. A narrow strip of grass, a few potted plants, a string of lights still hanging from last summer unlit. The air moved gently enough to be noticed, not enough to be called wind. The person was watering a cluster of bamboo planted along the fence. The hose released a steady stream, cool and clear, darkening the soil at the base. The bamboo stalks were thin, but tall, rising higher than the fence itself. As the breeze passed through, they leaned together, then apart, making a soft rustling sound. At first, the person didn't really see them. The mind was elsewhere, reviewing a conversation from earlier in the day. A small disagreement, nothing serious. But the body had reacted anyway. Shoulders lifted, breath shortened, thoughts circling around what should have been said differently. Why didn't I explain myself better? What if they misunderstood? I should have pushed back more. The hose slipped slightly in the person's hand, water splashing onto the concrete. They adjusted their grip, tightening it as if control over the hose might restore control everywhere else, too. The bamboo bent again with the breeze. One stalk leaned far enough that it brushed another, then gently tapped the fence before springing back upright. No sound of strain, no cracking, just movement. The person paused, noticing this now. The water kept running. The mind slowed just enough to take in the scene. The bamboo didn't resist the wind. It didn't brace against it. It moved with it. The person remembered something said once long ago. Not as advice, just as an observation. Things that survive strong weather are rarely the stiffest ones. The hose was lowered slightly, easing the pressure. The stream softened. Water pooled calmly at the base of the plants, soaking in instead of splashing outward. Inside the chest, something mirrored that change. Overthinking often grows out of rigidity. The belief that there is one correct response, one safe position, one version of events that must be defended. When the mind locks onto that idea, every alternative feels like a threat. The person realized how much of the day had been spent bracing, holding opinions firmly, holding expectations tightly, holding the body in a way that assumed impact was coming. Another breeze passed through. The bamboo leaned again farther, this time moving together like a single organism rather than separate pieces. When the air settled, they returned to center without effort. The person tried something small. Instead of replaying the conversation, they allowed the image to blur, not pushing it away, just not gripping it so hard. It didn't disappear, but it loosened. The water shut off with a soft click. Silence settled, broken only by leaves shifting and a distant car passing on the street beyond the fence. The person set the hose down and rolled their shoulders once slowly, noticing how tight they had been. It's easy to confuse flexibility with weakness. Many people do. They imagine that if they don't hold their position firmly, they'll lose ground, lose respect, lose safety. But the bamboo didn't look weak. It looked alive. The person reached out and touched one of the stalks. It was smooth, cool, surprisingly resilient. When pushed gently, it moved. When released, it returned. The mind made a quiet connection, not as a lesson, just as a feeling. What if being okay didn't require so much resistance? What if peace wasn't about holding everything in place, but about allowing movement without panic? A memory surfaced of other moments like this. Times when pushing harder had only created more tension. Times when letting go just slightly had allowed things to resolve on their own. The person hadn't noticed how tired they were until that thought arrived. The bamboo swayed again, responding to a breeze the person hadn't felt on their own skin yet. The plant sensed it first, adjusted before impact. That too felt familiar. Sometimes the body knows before the mind does. Sometimes the best response happens without debate. The person stood there for a while longer, not thinking about the bamboo anymore, but staying with the rhythm of the yard. Light shifting, air moving, muscles gradually softening without instruction. The conversation from earlier returned once briefly, but this time it didn't demand a rewrite. It passed through like wind through leaves, leaving no damage behind. And for now, that was enough movement. As the light shifted toward evening, the backyard took on a quieter tone. Shadows stretched across the ground, and the air cooled just enough to invite a slower pace. The person remained where they were, hands resting loosely at their sides, noticing how different the body felt compared to a few minutes earlier. The bamboo continued its gentle movement. Not constant, not dramatic, just responsive. A breeze would arrive, the stalks would lean, then return. No hesitation, no argument. The mind, however, didn't move as easily. A familiar urge returned, the need to make sense of things, to decide what flexibility should look like, to define when to bend and when to stand firm. The person noticed this urge without immediately following it, the way one might notice a habit forming before it fully takes over. It was subtle but important. Overthinking often disguises itself as preparation, as intelligence, as care. It convinces us that staying tense is the same as staying safe. But standing there watching the bamboo, it was clear that constant stiffness wasn't protection. It was strain. One stalk leaned farther than the others, brushing the fence again. This time the person noticed the sound more clearly. A soft tap, then nothing. The fence didn't break. The bamboo didn't crack. Both adjusted briefly, sharing space. There was something quietly instructive about that moment, even without putting words to it. The person thought about how often their own mind treated pressure differently. How a single comment could feel like an attack, how uncertainty could feel like failure, how small changes in plans could trigger a flood of imagined outcomes. The bamboo didn't imagine outcomes. It responded to what was actually happening. A breeze passed through again, slightly stronger this time. The stalks bent together, some more than others depending on where they stood. Each one responded in its own way, without comparison. The person took a slow breath in, then out, not as a technique, but because the body seemed to request it. The chest rose and fell naturally. The shoulders dropped another fraction. It became clear that flexibility wasn't about giving in. It was about staying present enough to move with what was real, instead of fighting what might happen. The person walked a few steps closer to the bamboo, looking up at how high the stalks reached. They had grown that tall not by resisting every gust, but by surviving many of them, by yielding just enough again and again. There was a quiet recognition rigidity had cost more energy than it had ever saved. The conversation from earlier in the day surfaced again, but now it felt different. Less like a problem to solve, more like a moment that had already passed. The words couldn't be edited anymore. The outcome couldn't be controlled. And yet nothing terrible had happened. The bamboo swayed once more, then settled. The air stilled. The yard felt suspended in a calm that didn't need explanation. The person noticed how often they had mistaken tension for strength. How the body had learned to stay ready even when there was nothing to brace against. Letting go of that habit didn't require force. It required permission. Permission to not be perfectly defended. Permission to not hold a single position all the time. Permission to adjust. The person stepped back, giving the bamboo space again. The hose lay where it had been set down, forgotten. The water absorbed into the soil unseen now, doing its work quietly. Somewhere nearby, a door closed. A distant voice carried briefly, then faded. Life continued beyond the fence, moving in countless ways the person couldn't track or manage. And that too felt acceptable. The bamboo would keep responding to the wind long after this moment. The wind would come and go, indifferent to how it was received. Neither needed to win. The person turned toward the house, not rushing, not resisting, just moving with the evening as it arrived. Inside, there would be more thoughts, more decisions, more moments that invited tension. That hadn't changed. What had shifted was something simpler. The understanding that peace didn't come from standing unmovable, but from learning how to bend without fear. The bamboo leaned one last time as the breeze returned, then straightened again, exactly as it always had. And the person carried that image with them, not as a rule, not as advice, but as a quiet reference point, ready to return whenever the mind began to stiffen again. The kind of anger that scares you isn't always the loud kind. Sometimes it's the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't shout. It just hardens. It settles in like dry ground that hasn't seen rain in a long time. You can still function. You can still smile at the right times. You can still get through a day. But inside, everything feels stiff, tight, like you've stopped expecting softness because softness keeps getting stepped on. That night, they were standing at the kitchen sink, sleeves pushed up the faucet, running in a thin, steady stream. The dishwasher was on behind them, doing its slow, rhythmic job, water moving, turning, humming like a distant machine in a different room. The only light in the kitchen came from a small lamp on the counter. Warm, dim, enough. They weren't washing dishes because the dishes demanded it. They were washing dishes because their hands needed something simple to do. Earlier, there had been a moment at work that shouldn't have mattered this much. A comment, a little edge in someone's voice, a kind of casual impatience that landed like a slap because it wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the fifth. It was just part of the pattern. The kind of pattern that makes your body start bracing before you even walk into the building. They had nodded, kept their tone neutral, done what they needed to do. On the outside, it looked fine. But on the drive home, their mind began building the whole case. Everything they should have said. Everything they were tired of swallowing. All the small humiliations that stacked up until one more made the pile topple. Now in the kitchen, the anger wasn't exploding. It was simmering. It felt like a tight band around the ribs, like pressure behind the eyes, like the urge to be sharp with anyone who got too close. They set a mug on the counter and poured hot water into it. The steam rose quietly. They dropped in a tea bag, nothing fancy, just something familiar, and watched the water darken in slow swirls. The spoon hit the side of the mug with a soft clink as they stirred. Clink, clink, clink. A small sound, a steady sound, a sound that didn't argue with them. They didn't think, I need to forgive. That would have felt ridiculous. Too big, too clean. They weren't in a clean place. They were in a tired place. The kind of tired that makes anger feel like armor. They took one sip. Too hot. They set the mug down, exhaled through their nose, and turned back to the sink. A plate, a fork, a pan with a stubborn ring of dried sauce that required more effort than it deserved. They scrubbed a little too hard at first. The sponge squeaked. Their hand pressed down like the pan had personally offended them. And then they noticed what they were doing. Not in a judging way, just noticing. It was the same pressure they wanted to put into their words earlier, the same force behind the message they almost wanted to send, the same desire to make something give. They stopped scrubbing for a second and let the pan sit under the warm water. The heat loosened the dried ring without drama, without violence, just time and warmth and repetition. They watched it soften, and something in their chest shifted, not because the problem was solved, but because the method was different. They didn't have to attack the pan to change it. They didn't have to punish it. They didn't have to win. They just had to stay with it long enough, gently enough for it to loosen. It felt almost annoying how true that was. Anger wants immediate results. It wants a moment that feels satisfying, a sharp sentence, a comeback, a slammed door, a message that lands like a punch. But life rarely changes from one punch. Life changes from what you keep doing over time, from what you repeat. They rinsed the pan, set it aside, and listened to the dishwasher hum. The kitchen smelled faintly like soap and steam. The night outside the window was dark and still. They thought about the person who'd been sharp with them earlier. Just for a second. Not as an enemy, not as a villain. Just as a human body moving through a day. A person with their own tight chest, their own pressure, their own dry places inside. That thought didn't make what happened okay. It didn't erase anything. But it did something small. It loosened the story that said, "This is personal. This is about me. They're doing this because I'm not worth respect." Maybe it wasn't about worth at all. Maybe it was about dryness meeting dryness. They took another sip of tea. Still hot but drinkable now. Their shoulders lowered a fraction. They looked at the sink, still full of dishes, still unfinished. They didn't feel cheerful. They didn't feel saintly. They just felt a little less clenched. Outside, the world wasn't dramatic either. The night didn't demand a verdict. The night didn't ask them to be the bigger person in some heroic way. It just offered a quiet space where the heat could cool if they stopped adding fuel. They turned the faucet down and let the water run softer. A calmer sound. Less force, more flow. And they kept going, one plate, one fork, one slow breath at a time, without trying to fix their whole heart in a single evening. They left the last dish in the rack to dry on its own and turned off the faucet. The sudden quiet felt louder than the water had been. For a moment they just stood there, hands resting on the edge of the sink, feeling the warmth slowly leave their skin. The anger was still present. It hadn't vanished during the dishes. It just wasn't hard anymore. It felt more like a sore muscle than a clenched fist. Something tender instead of sharp. They carried the mug to the table and sat down, wrapping both hands around it. The heat seeped in steady and patient. Outside the window, the night had settled into a deep stillness. No cars passed. No voices floated up. Just the faint reflection of the kitchen light on dark glass. They thought again about the moment from earlier. The tone, the look, the way the comment had landed. Their body replayed it, but this time the replay didn't speed up. It moved slower, like a scene watched from a little farther away. What stood out now wasn't the words themselves, but the weariness underneath them. Not just in the other person, but in themselves. The exhaustion of always adjusting, of always absorbing the edge so things wouldn't escalate, of carrying the unspoken expectation to be patient, to be kind, to be the one who smooths things over. That was the part that had hardened. Not cruelty, fatigue. They set the mug down and leaned back in the chair. The anger had been trying to protect that tired place. It had been saying, "Enough. I can't keep being scraped like this." When they saw it that way, the anger made more sense. It wasn't something to crush. It was something to listen to carefully. Gentleness didn't mean ignoring that message. It meant deciding how to respond to it. They imagined what would happen if they reacted the way the anger wanted. The sharp words, the cold distance, the satisfaction that would last a few seconds, maybe a minute. And then the quiet aftermath, the tension, the regret, the sense of having made things harder, not clearer. They'd been there before. They also imagined doing nothing, just swallowing it again, letting the dryness stay dry. That path felt familiar too, and heavy. So they looked for a third option, not dramatic, not noble, just workable. The rain image came back to them not as poetry, but as something practical. Dry ground doesn't soften all at once. You don't pour a bucket of water on it and expect it to change. That just runs off the surface. What changes it is slow rain, repeated, unimpressive. The kind you barely notice until one day the ground gives a little under your foot. They didn't need to forgive everything tonight. They didn't need to have the perfect conversation. They just needed to choose one small action that didn't add more heat. They picked up their phone and opened a blank note. Not a message, just a place to put words where they wouldn't hurt anyone. They wrote a few sentences, plain, honest, unpolished. What had bothered them? What they wished had been different, where they felt stretched thin. They didn't analyze the sentences. They didn't turn them into a script. They just let them exist. When they finished, they closed the note without saving it. The anger eased a little more, not because it had been solved, but because it had been acknowledged. They rinsed the mug and set it in the rack. The dishwasher hummed on, steady and unbothered by any of this. The kitchen light felt softer now, like it had dimmed on its own. Tomorrow they might say something. Or they might wait and see. They could choose their moment, their tone, their timing. That choice didn't have to be made under pressure. It didn't have to be made while their chest was still tight. Forgiveness, they realized, didn't have to look like warmth towards someone who had been careless. Sometimes it looked like not turning hard yourself, like keeping your own inner ground from cracking further. They turned off the kitchen light and walked into the darker part of the house. The air felt cooler, calmer. The anger was still there, faint, but present, like the smell of rain after it stopped. They lay down without replaying the moment again. Their breath found a slower pace, not because they forced it, but because nothing was pushing anymore. The ground inside them hadn't turned soft overnight, but it had absorbed a little water, and that was enough for now. They stood at the stainless steel sink at the back of the restaurant, sleeves rolled up, the air still warm from the dinner rush. Most of the noise had faded now. No more orders being called. No more clatter of pans. Just water and breath. A crate of vegetables waited on the counter. Carrots, green onions, and a bundle of lotus roots still streaked with dark mud. They picked one up. It was heavier than it looked. Cold. Rough in places where the dirt clung stubbornly to the skin. They turned on the tap. Water hit metal with a steady, familiar sound. Not loud, not quiet, just constant. They began to rinse the root, slowly rubbing the surface with their thumbs. Mud loosened and slid away in thin brown lines, disappearing down the drain. They had cooked lotus root many times before. Sliced thin for stir-fry, thicker for soup. Sometimes fried, sometimes braised. They knew what it looked like inside. Pale, clean, marked with small round holes like a quiet pattern. Still, every time they washed one, the contrast caught them off guard. So much darkness on the outside. Such a clean structure within. Their mind drifted, as it often did during these late moments when the body was busy and the thoughts had room to move. They thought about where they came from, about the parts of their life they didn't usually talk about. The years that felt heavy with mistakes, silence, and choices they didn't know how to explain without flinching. There were things they had buried deep, not because they were evil, just because they were painful. They rinsed again. More mud came off. They remembered how often they felt the need to clean themselves before letting anyone look too closely, as if the mess had to be gone first, as if healing required a perfect story. They had learned early that it was easier to be acceptable than honest. The water kept running. They turned the lotus root in their hands and found a stubborn patch of dirt lodged in a shallow groove. They pressed harder this time, working it loose. For a moment, they wondered why lotus grew this way at all. Why something meant to become a flower had to begin in thick black mud. It seemed unfair. Other plants reached for the sun right away. Lotus had to start where the water was heavy and the light barely reached. They paused, holding the root under the stream. Then it occurred to them quietly, without any drama. The mud wasn't a mistake. It wasn't something the lotus survived despite. It was the condition that made the lotus possible. Without that depth, without that pressure, there would be no flower later on. They felt something soften in their chest. Not relief, not forgiveness, just understanding. They set the cleaned root on the cutting board and picked up the knife. The blade met the surface with a solid, gentle sound. The first slice revealed the inside. White, even, almost delicate. Nothing about it showed where it had come from. They sliced again and again. Each piece fell neatly to the side, identical in structure, calm in its simplicity. They thought about how often they judged themselves by their beginnings, by the mess, by the years that didn't look good when lined up neatly, as if growth was only valid when it started clean, as if beauty was supposed to arrive without passing through anything difficult first. They lined the slices into a small pile. Their hands moved steadily now, practiced and sure. The body knew what to do even when the mind wandered. They realized something then. Maybe they didn't need to erase the mud from their story. Maybe they didn't need to pretend it hadn't been there. Maybe it was enough to know that it had fed something deeper, something solid, something real. They turned off the water. The kitchen felt quieter without it. They looked down at the lotus slices one more time before gathering them up. Clean, ready, and still connected to where they came from. They carried the sliced lotus root over to the stove and set the pan down gently, careful not to rush the moment. The heat was low, just enough to warm the surface without forcing anything to happen too fast. As the pieces met the pan, a soft sound rose up, steady and calm. The kind of sound that didn't demand attention, but filled the space anyway. They stood there, stirring slowly, letting the rhythm guide their breathing. In moments like this, the body remembered things the mind often forgot. That growth didn't happen all at once. That warmth worked better than pressure. That forcing only made things tough. They thought again about the years they had spent trying to outgrow their past by pretending it wasn't there, as if distance alone could erase it, as if time automatically meant healing. But standing here now, they understood something more honest. Healing wasn't about cutting away everything that had been dark or painful. It was about learning how to hold those parts without letting them define every step forward. The lotus root softened as it cooked its sharp edges, rounding out its surface, taking on a gentle sheen. Nothing about it tried to hide where it had been. And yet, it was becoming something nourishing. They felt a quiet shift inside. The parts of their life that had grown in confusion, in struggle, in silence, those parts hadn't ruined them. They had given them depth, sensitivity, a way of seeing what others missed. They had learned patience from waiting, strength from staying, compassion from knowing what it felt like to be misunderstood. These weren't flaws. They were roots. They turned off the heat and let the pan rest, steam lifting slowly into the air. The kitchen felt different now. Not because anything had changed, but because they were no longer fighting their own story. They didn't need to rewrite it. They didn't need to clean it up for anyone else. What mattered was how they carried it forward. They plated the lotus root carefully, each slice placed with intention rather than urgency. It didn't have to be perfect. It only had to be honest. As they stepped out of the kitchen and into the cooler night air behind the building, they paused for a moment. The city sounded distant here, softened by walls and space. They took a slow breath and felt the ground under their feet. For the first time in a long while, they didn't feel the urge to escape their past or outrun it. It could stay where it was. It had already done its work, and now it was enough to keep growing. Fear doesn't always feel like danger. Sometimes it feels like timing. Like you're holding on just a second too long because letting go feels irresponsible even when staying put is slowly wearing you out. It was early evening, the kind of hour when the building is technically still open but mostly empty. A community gym sat between a daycare and a closed pizza place. Its windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside, meeting the cold outside. The parking lot lights had already come on, casting wide yellow circles on the asphalt. Inside the space was quiet in a way gyms rarely are. No music, no clanging weights. Just the faint echo of footsteps and the soft squeak of sneakers against polished floor. A person stood near the far wall holding a small bag of chalk in one hand. They hadn't meant to come here tonight. It was supposed to be a quick stop, maybe 10 minutes, just to move their body and clear their head. That was the story they told themselves. But they'd been standing there for a while now, not moving much at all. They rubbed a little chalk between their palms. The powder clung to their skin, pale and dry. When they clapped their hands once softly, a small cloud rose and drifted down. No drama, no audience. Above them, suspended from the ceiling, were two long straps used for training, nothing fancy, just sturdy and practical. They weren't here to perform. They weren't even especially good at this. What drew them back every so often was the pause. That moment in between. Lately, life had felt like one long hold. Holding a job that no longer fit. Holding a version of themselves they'd outgrown, but didn't know how to replace. Holding conversations in their head that never quite made it into the room. They had options. That was part of the problem. Too many ways this could go. Too many possible outcomes to weigh. So they held on, waiting for clarity to arrive first. It rarely does. They stepped onto the mat, shoes soft against the surface. The air smelled faintly of rubber and cleaning spray. Familiar. Neutral. Nothing that asked them to feel a certain way. They reached up and wrapped one hand around a strap. The grip felt solid, reliable. The second hand followed. Both palms now chalked, both arms engaged. The body knew what to do, even if the mind hesitated. There was a moment, always the same moment, when the ground stopped feeling like an option. When staying and letting go were suddenly the only two choices left. They didn't move yet. Fear showed up right on time. It sounded reasonable. What if you slip? What if you let go and there's nothing there? What if this is the wrong moment? Fear loves the space between actions. It thrives in pauses. It turns them into interrogations. They tightened their grip just a little. Their shoulders tensed. The strap didn't move. It didn't reassure them either. It simply existed. They remembered watching trapeze artists once years ago, not in person, but in a video. What stayed with them wasn't the swing or the catch. It was the release. That brief, weightless instant, when the performer wasn't holding anything yet, hadn't fallen either. That was the part that looked terrifying. That was also the part that looked free. They inhaled slow and steady, not as a technique, but because the body needed air. Their arms began to feel the effort of holding. Muscles don't lie. They don't care about plans or timing. They just respond to what's happening. Holding forever isn't an option. They shifted their weight slightly. The mat below seemed farther away than it actually was. The strap creaked faintly above a small sound that brought them back into the room. What if letting go isn't failure? What if it's just transition? The questions didn't arrive as conclusions. They were more like openings, cracks in the story fear had been telling. They thought about all the times they'd stayed too long. Not because it was right, but because leaving felt scarier than staying. The job, the city, the version of themselves that felt safe simply because it was familiar. Fear had convinced them that endurance was the same as strength. Their grip began to tire. Fingers flexed involuntarily. Chalk dust fell in tiny grains, catching the overhead light for a brief second before disappearing. They noticed something then. Noticed that the moment they'd been dreading wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost ordinary. Just a breath. Just a decision. They didn't let go yet, but they stopped tightening. That small change mattered. The body adjusted. Shoulders lowered a fraction. The strain softened. The fear lost a bit of its urgency when it wasn't being resisted or obeyed. They stayed there suspended between ground and movement, long enough to realize that the pause itself wasn't the enemy. It was just a space that didn't need to be filled with certainty. Below them, the mat waited. It always had. It wasn't judging the timing. It wasn't counting seconds. The only thing that felt heavy now was the idea that they had to know what came next before they were allowed to move. They exhaled. The pause widened. And for the first time that evening, they felt something loosen, not the grip, not yet, but the belief that holding on was the only safe option. Time didn't stretch the way it usually does when fear is in charge. It didn't race either. It simply continued steady and neutral, like the building itself breathing around them. They were still holding the strap, but the moment had changed. Not because something dramatic happened, but because something quietly stopped happening. They were no longer arguing with the pause. The body made small adjustments on its own. Fingers shifted. Wrists settled into a position that used less effort. The shoulders found a more honest place to rest. Holding was still work, but it wasn't desperate work anymore. Fear noticed the change and tried again, softer this time. You don't have to rush. You can wait a little longer. That voice didn't sound wrong. It sounded caring even. That's how fear keeps its influence, by disguising itself as caution. But underneath that voice was another truth, simpler and less dramatic. Waiting forever was also a choice, and not always a neutral one. They thought about how many times they'd confused readiness with certainty, as if the right moment would arrive fully formed, labeled clearly, leaving no room for doubt. As if hesitation was proof they weren't allowed to move yet. But nothing in the room worked that way. Not the straps, not the mat, not the muscles in their arms. Strength didn't come from knowing the future. It came from responding to the present. A faint echo of footsteps passed somewhere down the hall. Someone else finishing up. Someone else deciding when to leave. The sound faded quickly, leaving the gym quiet again. They shifted their weight once more, just enough to feel the motion. The strap responded, swinging slightly. A small movement, but it changed the geometry of everything. The body noticed. The mind followed. This, they realized, was the part no one talks about. Not the release itself, but the moment just before it, when you realize you're already in motion. That staying exactly where you are isn't actually possible anymore. They remembered how often they'd waited for permission, for reassurance, for someone or something to tell them it was okay to stop holding. But nothing external ever did. The permission had always come from inside, quietly, without ceremony. Their grip loosened by a fraction. Not enough to let go, but enough to feel the difference. The chalk on their palms no longer felt like security. It felt like residue from something that had already done its job. They exhaled again. This time the breath went all the way down, unforced, unplanned. The body recognized the shift before the mind named it. The fear changed shape. It wasn't gone. It had simply moved from the center to the edges. It no longer felt like a command. It felt like a sensation, tightness, alertness, energy. Something to work with, not something to obey. They let go. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough. The moment was exactly as the videos had suggested, and nothing like them at the same time. There was no rush of wind, no surge of panic. Just a brief, weightless sensation where the body was neither holding nor falling. A pause inside the pause. Then gravity did what gravity always does. The mat rose to meet them. Shoes touched down, knees bent naturally. The body absorbed the landing without comment. They stood there surprised by how normal it felt. No applause, no internal fireworks, just the quiet realization that the thing they'd been afraid of hadn't been an ending. It had been a transition short and manageable. They stepped off the mat and shook their hands gently, chalk dust drifting to the floor. Their arms felt warm now, alive in a way that wasn't strained. The kind of tired that comes from movement, not from holding. They sat down on a bench along the wall, breathing slowing on its own. The straps above swayed slightly, then came to rest. The room returned to stillness, unchanged by what had just happened. And yet something had shifted. Not in a way that demanded action tonight. Not in a way that solved anything immediately, but in a way that corrected a misunderstanding they'd been carrying for a long time. Letting go wasn't the opposite of strength. It was a different expression of it. They sat there for a while, hands resting on their thighs, noticing the ordinary details again. The hum of the lights, the faint smell of rubber, the scuff marks on the floor that told quiet stories of other people's pauses and releases. Life, they realized, had been asking for this kind of courage. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that looks good in hindsight. But the courage to trust a moment without guarantees. To release without knowing exactly what comes next. Eventually, they stood up, wiped their hands on a towel, and headed toward the exit. The door opened with a soft push. Cold air rushed in sharp and real. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, unchanged. They didn't feel fearless walking out into the night. They felt something better unburdened. The pause had done its work. And the next movement, whatever it would be, no longer felt like something to survive. Some problems don't block the entire road. They sit off to the side, visible but avoidable. And still, we manage to hurt ourselves on them. That evening, the person was pushing a shopping cart across a quiet parking lot. The store lights were bright but soft at this hour, and most cars were already gone. The air carried the faint smell of asphalt, cooling after a warm day. The cart wheels made a low, uneven sound as they rolled. It had been one of those days filled with small frustrations. Nothing worth complaining about out loud, yet enough to keep the mind busy. A delayed response. A misunderstanding that didn't get cleared up. A task that took longer than expected. None of it was urgent anymore. But the mind hadn't received that message. Near the edge of the parking lot, where the pavement met a thin strip of gravel, a large stone sat half embedded in the ground. It wasn't new. It had likely been there for years, pushed aside during construction and forgotten, big enough to notice, small enough that most people walked around it without thinking. The cart veered slightly as one wheel bumped the stone. Not hard, just enough to jolt the handle. The person felt irritation flare instantly. Of course. Why is that even there? Without pausing, the person nudged the cart forward again, this time with more force. The wheels struck the stone more directly. The cart stopped short. The handle pressed into the palms. A sharp, unpleasant sensation shot up the arms. The stone hadn't moved. The person exhaled through the nose, annoyed now not just at the obstacle, but at themselves. The cart was pulled back. The stone sat there unchanged, indifferent. That was when it became clear how familiar this moment felt. Overthinking often works this way. A small problem appears, something inconvenient but manageable. Instead of stepping around it, the mind runs straight into it again and again, hoping force will turn it into something else. The person stood there for a second, hands resting on the cart, feeling the lingering tension in the wrists. The parking lot was quiet enough that the sound of a distant engine starting could be heard across the way. Nothing was actually blocking the path. There was plenty of space to go around. Still, the mind replayed the earlier moments of the day. The comment that felt unnecessary. The email that could have been worded better. Each thought hit with the same stubborn insistence as the cart against the stone. If I push harder, it will change. If I think it through one more time, it will resolve. The person looked down at the stone more closely now. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't threatening. Just solid, heavy, exactly what it was. Some problems are like that. They don't respond to pressure. They don't explain themselves. They simply exist. The person adjusted their grip on the cart, turning it slightly to the side. The wheels rolled smoothly this time, bypassing the stone completely. No resistance, no jolt. The body relaxed almost immediately. That small ease was noticeable. Not dramatic, but clear. The shoulders dropped. The breath slowed. The irritation didn't need to be argued with. It just didn't have anything to push against anymore. Walking toward the car, the person felt a quiet recognition settle in. How often had the day been spent pushing against things that couldn't be changed? Replaying moments that were already over. Pressing into worries that only grew harder with attention. The groceries were placed into the trunk, one bag at a time. Each movement was simple, mechanical, grounding. The sound of plastic bags rustling, the dull thud as they were set down. The stone remained behind, unchanged as the cart was returned to its place. Overthinking has a way of convincing us that engagement equals control. That if we keep addressing the issue, it will eventually soften. But some obstacles aren't meant to be confronted head-on. They aren't personal. They aren't tests. They're just there. The person closed the trunk and leaned briefly against the car, noticing the cool metal through their jacket. The earlier frustrations were still present, but they no longer pressed as sharply. Not everything needs to be fixed. Not everything needs a response. Sometimes the simplest relief comes not from pushing through, but from choosing a different path entirely. The stone stayed where it was doing nothing at all. And for the first time that day, the person didn't feel the need to do anything about it. The drive home was quiet. Streetlights passed at a steady rhythm one after another, casting brief pools of light across the windshield. The radio stayed off. The person didn't feel the need to fill the space with sound. At a red light, the mind tried to return to its old pattern that moment earlier. That response could have been different. Maybe next time. The thought began, then paused. There was a small awareness now, like a hand hovering just before touching something hot. The recognition came gently. This feels like pushing the cart into the stone again. The light turned green. The car moved forward. The thought didn't finish its sentence. Overthinking doesn't always feel aggressive. Often, it feels responsible. Like a duty to review, prepare, and prevent future discomfort. But most of the time, it's just repetition without movement. The same angle, the same pressure, the same result. At home, the person carried the groceries inside. The kitchen light came on warm and familiar. Bags were set on the counter. Keys were placed in their usual spot. The ordinary sounds of evening settled in. One bag tipped slightly, and a can rolled toward the edge of the counter before stopping. The person reached out and steadied it without irritation. No commentary followed. Just a simple adjustment. That too was noticed. The stone from the parking lot returned to mind, not as an image, but as a feeling. Solid, neutral, unmoved by effort. The realization wasn't new, but it felt clearer now. Many worries are exactly like that stone. They don't shift when kicked. They only bruise the one doing the kicking. The person leaned against the counter arms, resting loosely. There was a sense of tiredness there, but also relief. The kind that comes when you stop arguing with what is already in place. Some problems don't require solutions, they require distance. The mind tried once more to circle back. What if ignoring it makes things worse? What if going around is avoidance? The question lingered briefly, then softened. Avoidance runs from reality. Going around accepts it. There's a difference, even if it takes time to feel it. Outside, a car passed, tires humming against the road. Inside, the refrigerator clicked on quietly. Life continued in these small, unremarkable ways, untouched by the earlier frustrations. The person thought about how many times the day had been spent hitting the same mental obstacle, replaying words, rehearsing explanations, expecting a different outcome from the same motion. It wasn't wrong to care. It was just unnecessary to collide. The stone wasn't an enemy. It wasn't a failure. It was simply not the path. Later, as the evening settled further, the person stepped outside, briefly standing near the front door. The street was calm. Porch lights glowed softly. Nothing demanded attention. The mind felt quieter, not empty, but less crowded. Thoughts still appeared, but they didn't line up for inspection. They passed like pedestrians crossing a wide street, each one heading somewhere else. There was a quiet understanding forming, not as a rule, but as an option. Next time something feels immovable, it might not be a signal to push harder. It might be an invitation to step aside. No effort required, no defeat implied, just a different direction. The person went back inside, closed the door, and let the evening continue without adding anything extra to it. Some stones remain by the road for years. They don't need to be moved. They don't need to be conquered. They only need to be noticed and then passed by. And that was enough. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.